Have you ever been completely invisible in a crowded room, only to suddenly become the center of a cruel, unforgiving spectacle? We like to believe that in our darkest, most vulnerable moments, human decency will prevail. We expect a stranger to lend a hand, to stand up for what is right. But what happens when the crowd just stares, pulls out their phones, and watches you break? This is the true story of a young woman pushed to her absolute limit in a crowded airport, and the unbelievable moment, a combat-hardened Navy SEAL and his K-9 decided they had seen enough. Chicago O'Hare International Airport on a Friday afternoon in late November was less a transportation hub and more a localized ring of purgatory. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, headache-inducing hum, casting a sickly pallor over the thousands of weary travelers packed into Terminal 3. Outside, a sleet storm was punishing the tarmac, grounding flights and fraying nerves. For 28-year-old Chloe Henderson, the airport was already a battlefield on a good day. 3 years ago, a catastrophic collision with a drunk driver on Interstate 95 had fractured her T12 vertebra, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, her life had been a masterclass in adaptation. Her custom matte black titanium wheelchair was an extension of her own body, a symbol of both her shattered past and her hard-fought independence. Today, she was traveling alone to Denver for her older sister's wedding, a trip she had been meticulously planning for 6 months. Navigating the sea of oblivious pedestrians required hyper-vigilance. People rarely looked down. They stared at their phones, dragged overstuffed roller bags blindly behind them, and abruptly stopped in the middle of busy concourses. Chloe's shoulders ached from the constant course corrections, her hands slightly calloused from the friction of the push rims. She finally made it to gate K4. The departure board flashed the dreaded red letters. Delayed. New time. 4:45 p.m. Chloe sighed, finding a small pocket of space near the oversized windows. She locked her wheels and arranged her belongings. A small backpack resting on her footrest and a carefully wrapped, fragile glass vase sitting securely on her lap. It was a vintage piece she had scoured antique shops to find. A perfect wedding gift for her sister. The atmosphere at the gate was suffocating. Stranded passengers were growing restless, their murmurs escalating into loud, abrasive complaints. At the center of the unrest was a man pacing furiously near the boarding desk. His name was Jonah Harrington, though Chloe didn't know that yet. What she did know was that he exuded an aura of arrogant impatience that demanded everyone's attention. He was in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place amidst the sweatpants and travel pillows of the general public. A heavy gold Rolex flashed on his wrist as he aggressively gestured toward the beleaguered gate agent. "I don't care about the de-icing schedule, Brenda," Jonah snapped, reading the agent's name tag with a sneer. He was speaking loud enough for the first 5 rows of seating to hear perfectly. "I am a global services member. My time is worth more per hour than you make in a fiscal quarter. You need to put me on the next plane out, or I will have your supervisor out here revoking your badge." Brenda Walsh, a gate agent who looked like she had been working for 14 hours straight, offered a tight customer service smile that barely masked her exhaustion. "Sir, all flights are grounded due to weather. Status does not clear the runway. We ask for your patience." Jonah scoffed loudly, turning on his heel and pacing back into the crowd, nearly knocking over a teenager with his heavy leather Toomey carry-on. He muttered about incompetent sheep and aggressively began typing on his phone. Chloe watched the interaction with a sinking feeling. She recognized the type. Men like Jonah didn't see people. They saw obstacles. And as a woman in a wheelchair, Chloe was profoundly aware that in the eyes of society's most entitled, she was the ultimate inconvenience. She took a deep breath, clutching the wrapped vase on her lap, and prayed the boarding process would go smoothly. But as the intercom crackled to life 10 minutes later, signaling a break in the weather and the start of the boarding process, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. It ignited. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are finally cleared for departure for Flight 1184 to Denver." Brenda's voice echoed through the PA system, met with a chorus of exhausted cheers and the immediate rustling of luggage. "We will begin with pre-boarding. We invite passengers needing special assistance, wheelchairs, and families with children under 2 to approach the desk." This was Chloe's cue. Pre-boarding wasn't a luxury. It was a logistical necessity. Transferring from her custom chair into the narrow, claustrophobic aisle chair used to get her down the plane's center aisle took time, space, and a measure of dignity that was impossible to maintain, while hundreds of impatient people watched. She unlocked her wheels and began navigating the short distance to the blue priority lane. The crowd, desperate to get on the plane after the 3-hour delay, had already converged on the boarding area, forming an impenetrable wall of bodies. "Excuse me," Chloe said softly, trying to wedge her chair between a family of 4 and a pile of duty-free bags. "Pardon me, I need to get to the desk." A few people shuffled an inch or two, offering apologetic grimaces, but the path remained mostly blocked. Chloe pushed a little harder, her wheels rolling over the edge of someone's stray jacket. She was almost at the podium when a harsh voice cut through the clamor. "Oh, for God's sake, are you kidding me?" Jonah Harrington stepped directly into the priority lane, blocking Chloe's path. He had a boarding pass clutched in his hand, his face flushed with indignation. "Excuse me, sir," Chloe said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden spike of adrenaline in her chest. "They called pre-boarding. I need to get through." Jonah looked down at her. His eyes swept over her wheelchair, her wrapped package, and her tired face. There was no pity in his gaze, only profound annoyance. "They also called first class and diamond members," Jonah lied, his voice booming over the ambient noise. "Some of us have actual business to attend to. We've been waiting 3 hours. I'm not waiting another 20 minutes for them to hoist you onto the plane like cargo." A hush fell over the immediate area. People stopped checking their phones. A few heads turned. "Sir, Brenda, the gate agent, called out weakly from the podium. She has the right of way. Please step aside." But Brenda didn't leave the safety of her desk. She didn't physically intervene, and Jonah, sensing the lack of real authority, doubled down. "I'm not moving," he snapped at the agent, then looked back at Chloe. "You people always expect the world to stop and part like the Red Sea for you. You're a bottleneck. Move to the side and let the people paying top dollar get on first. You can take your time when the line is clear." Chloe felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. Her hands gripped the push rims tightly. "I am just trying to board the plane," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Please." Instead of stepping aside, Jonah aggressively pulled his heavy leather Toomey suitcase past her to force his way to the scanner. In his reckless haste, the solid plastic wheel of his heavy luggage slammed violently against the quick-release axle of Chloe's wheelchair. The impact violently jerked the chair to the right. Chloe, lacking core stability, was thrown off balance. She instinctively threw her hands out to catch herself on the armrests, letting go of the items on her lap. Her backpack hit the floor with a thud, medical supplies and personal items spilling across the patterned carpet. But worse was the sound of the wrapped box hitting the ground. Crash. The distinct, sickening sound of shattering glass echoed clearly over the murmur of the crowd. The vintage vase, her sister's wedding gift, was instantly reduced to jagged shards inside its decorative wrapping. Chloe froze. She stared at the crushed box, her vision blurring with sudden tears of frustration and helplessness. "Look what you did," Jonah yelled, incredibly pivoting to play the victim. "You're a hazard. You practically steered right into me. Who lets you out here by yourself?" Chloe looked around desperately. Dozens of people were standing within 5 feet of her. 2 teenagers had their phones out, the red recording lights blinking. A businessman in a tan trench coat averted his eyes and looked at his shoes. A mother pulled her child closer, stepping away from the mess. Nobody said a word. Nobody told Jonah to stop. Nobody knelt to help Chloe pick up her scattered medical catheters, her fallen boarding pass, or the ruined gift. The apathy of the crowd was a physical weight, pressing down on her, shrinking her until she felt completely invisible. "Miss," Brenda's voice cracked nervously over the intercom. "Miss, if you've dropped something, you're going to have to clear the lane. You're holding up the boarding process. Sir, go ahead and scan your pass." Jonah smirked, a cruel, victorious expression. He adjusted his suit jacket, kicked Chloe's fallen boarding pass slightly to the left to clear his path, and stepped up to the scanner. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Chloe sat there, humiliated, paralyzed both physically and emotionally, as the tears finally spilled over her cheeks. She reached down, struggling to grasp the zipper of her fallen bag, her fingers trembling so badly she couldn't catch the fabric. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, until a shadow fell over her. Chief Petty Officer David Caldwell was intimately familiar with the concept of acceptable collateral damage, but he had a zero-tolerance policy for bullies. David was standing 30 feet away, leaning against a structural pillar, nursing a lukewarm black coffee. He was a man carved from granite and quiet trauma, 6'3", broad-shouldered, with intensely sharp green eyes and a closely cropped fade. He possessed a stillness that was almost unnerving. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a fitted black Henley, and a tan tactical jacket, but his posture screamed military. He had just returned stateside after a grueling 9-month deployment with Navy SEAL Team 6. Sitting in a perfect heel position beside his left leg was Titan. Titan was a 90-pound sable German Shepherd, an elite combat tracker and explosive ordnance disposal K9. He wore a customized tactical harness with the words, "Do not pet," working K9 patched on the sides. Titan was not a service dog meant for emotional support. He was a highly trained weapon and a lifesaver, a veteran of night raids and hostile environments. Yet, the bond between the dog and the SEAL was closer than blood. David hated airports. He hated the noise, the crowds, and mostly, he hated the overwhelming sense of entitlement he saw in the civilian world. After spending the better part of a year watching men die over patches of dust, watching people throw tantrums over delayed flights felt nauseating. He had been watching the scene at Gate K4 unfold for the past 5 minutes. Titan, highly attuned to his handler's heart rate and micro-expressions, had shifted his weight 2 minutes ago, his ears swiveling toward the commotion. When Jonah Harrington had first started yelling at the gate agent, David had simply narrowed his eyes. Loudmouth, he thought. Ignore him. But then the pre-boarding was called. David watched the woman in the wheelchair attempt to navigate the crowd. He recognized the matte black chair. It was top of the line, built for someone who lived in it permanently. He saw her struggle, and then he saw the man in the suit step in front of her. David's jaw tightened. Titan let out a low, barely audible rumble in his chest. "I know, buddy," David thought. When Jonah slammed his luggage into the chair, knocking the woman's belongings to the ground and causing the glass to shatter, David's coffee cup crumpled slightly in his grip. But when Jonah stood over her, verbally berating her while she sat trapped and crying, and the crowd did absolutely nothing, a cold, deadly calm washed over the SEAL. He tossed his coffee into a nearby trash can. "Heel, Titan," he said softly. The dog fell into perfect, silent synchronization with David's long strides. The crowd, previously glued to the spectacle of Chloe's humiliation, suddenly found their attention drawn to the approaching pair. It was like watching a predator move through a herd of sheep. People instinctively parted, stepping back quickly to create a wide berth for the imposing man and the massive, wolf-like dog at his side. Jonah had just scanned his ticket. The machine beeped green. He grabbed his Toomey bag and turned back to look at Chloe, who was still desperately trying to gather her medical supplies. "Next time, stay out of the way," Jonah sneered, preparing to walk down the jet bridge. "Don't take another step." The voice wasn't a shout. It wasn't hysterical. It was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a man accustomed to giving orders in war zones. It cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a knife, freezing everyone in a 50-foot radius. Jonah stopped, turning around with an annoyed scoff. "Excuse me? Do you know who?" His words died in his throat. David Caldwell had stopped directly between Jonah and the jet bridge entrance. Titan was sitting beside him, his amber eyes locked unblinkingly on Jonah's face. The dog wasn't barking or growling, but his posture was coiled, radiating a lethal readiness that triggered an instinctual fear response in the businessman. "I don't care who you are," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked at Jonah with a gaze so intensely cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the terminal. "Drop the bag." Jonah puffed out his chest, though his face paled slightly. "Listen here, pal. I am a Diamond member. I have every right to board. This woman rammed into my luggage." David took one slow step forward. Titan moved with him, perfectly mirrored. "I watched you ram her chair," David said, the quiet menace in his tone echoing through the now silent boarding area. The passengers who had been recording Chloe suddenly pointed their phones at David. "I watched you break her property, and I listened to you berate her while she was defenseless." David briefly broke eye contact with the man, looking down at Chloe. The absolute ice in his eyes melted for a fraction of a second, replaced by a deep, respectful empathy. He saw her shaking hands, the scattered catheters, the ruined box. He looked back at Jonah. "You have 10 seconds to get on your hands and knees," David instructed softly, his voice echoing out to the stunned crowd, "and pick up every single item you knocked out of this young lady's hands. You will place them gently into her bag. And then you are going to apologize." Jonah let out a nervous, incredulous laugh, looking around at the crowd for support. Finding none, he puffed himself up. "Are you out of your mind? I'm not picking up her garbage. I have a flight to catch. Now get your mud out of my way before I call security." He took a step toward the jet bridge, trying to push past David. It was a monumental mistake. David didn't strike him. He didn't have to. With blinding speed, David simply stepped into Jonah's path and closed the distance, squaring his shoulders so he towered over the older man. Simultaneously, Titan rose to all fours, letting out a sharp, guttural, earth-shaking bark that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing nearby. Jonah stumbled backward, tripping over his own expensive suitcase, and landed hard on his backside, his face entirely devoid of color. The terminal was dead silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the German shepherd. "Call security," David whispered, staring down at the trembling man. "Please, let's show them the tapes." The silence in Terminal 3 was profound, broken only by the sharp, sleet-driven wind battering the glass outside and the low, mechanical hum of the airport ventilation. Jonah Harrington sat sprawled on the ugly, patterned carpet, his expensive charcoal suit rumpled, staring up at the immovable wall of muscle and quiet fury that was Chief Petty Officer David Caldwell. "You assaulted me," Jonah finally sputtered, his voice cracking. He scrambled backward, trying to put distance between himself and the 90-pound sable German shepherd whose amber eyes had not blinked once. Everyone saw it. "He pushed me. That dog attacked me." David didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides. "I didn't touch you, and Titan hasn't moved an inch. You tripped over your own arrogance." "Security!" Jonah shrieked, his manicured hands desperately patting the floor as he scrambled to his feet. "I want airport police right now." Almost on cue, the crowd parted again. 2 TSA security officers and a Chicago Police Department airport liaison, Officer Gregory Miller, pushed through the perimeter. They took in the scene. A sobbing woman in a wheelchair, broken glass, a frantic man in a suit, and a towering man with a military-grade K9. Officer Miller instinctively placed a hand over his radio. "All right, what's the problem here? Who's causing a disturbance?" Jonah practically lunged toward the officers, pointing a trembling finger at David. "Arrest him. This maniac and his vicious animal just threatened my life. I am a Global Services member, and I demand he be detained." Officer Miller looked at David, sizing him up. He noted the tactical stance, the calm demeanor, and the specialized working harness on the dog. "Sir," Miller said cautiously, "is this true? Did you threaten this man?" Before David could speak, the dam finally broke. The apathy of the crowd, shattered by David's intervention, was suddenly replaced by a tidal wave of collective guilt and sudden, fierce courage. "He's lying," a voice yelled out. It was the mother who had previously pulled her child away. She stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. That man in the suit pushed his way to the front, slammed his heavy bag into that poor girl's wheelchair, and broke her things. "Yeah," chimed in one of the teenagers, holding up his smartphone like a shield. "I have the whole thing on video. The guy in the suit was screaming at her and wouldn't let her board. The guy with the dog just told him to pick her stuff up." Officer Miller turned to the teenager. "Show me." For 2 tense minutes, the police officer and the 2 TSA agents huddled around the glowing screen of the iPhone. The audio played clearly Jonah's sneering voice, the sickening crash of the glass, the heartless demand that Chloe move out of his way. Then, the video showed David stepping in, calm and authoritative, without laying a single finger on Jonah. When Officer Miller looked up, his expression had hardened entirely. He turned slowly toward Jonah, who was suddenly sweating profusely despite the terminal's chill. "Sir," Officer Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, "it appears you are the instigator of this incident. You willfully damaged another passenger's property and created a hostile environment. Hand me your boarding pass and your ID." You can't be serious, Jonah bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. I have a board meeting in Denver. You can't listen to these sheep. I'm calling the airline's corporate office. You can call whoever you want from the concourse, Miller replied coldly. Because you are not getting on flight 1184. Brenda! Jonah shouted at the gate agent, who was still clutching the microphone at the podium. Tell them who I am. Brenda Walsh looked at Jonah, then down at Chloe, and finally at David. She straightened her posture, finding a backbone she hadn't utilized in years. Officers, Brenda said clearly over the PA system. The airline is officially refusing service to Mr. Harrington due to abusive behavior toward passengers and staff. His ticket is canceled. A spontaneous, rippling round of applause broke out across Gate K4. Jonah looked around, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization that his money and status had utterly failed him in the face of absolute, undeniable public exposure broke him. Escorted by the 2 TSA agents, he was marched away from the gate, his heavy leather Toomey bag dragging mournfully behind him. David watched him go until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did the tension bleed out of his broad shoulders. He looked down at Titan. At ease, he murmured. The dog instantly broke his rigid posture, his tail giving a single heavy wag. David turned his back to the clapping crowd and dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to eye level with Chloe. Chloe was trembling. The adrenaline crash was brutal, leaving her feeling hollowed out and utterly exhausted. The applause of the crowd felt surreal, almost mocking after their prolonged silence, but the man kneeling in front of her grounded her back in reality. Up close, David Caldwell's eyes were a startling shade of forest green, etched with lines of profound exhaustion that only a combat veteran could truly recognize in another survivor. "Are you hurt?" David asked. His voice, previously a weapon used to shatter Jonah's ego, was now incredibly soft, possessing the gentle cadence of a man gentling a spooked horse. "No," Chloe whispered, swiping at a tear that had escaped down her cheek. My chair. And my things." David nodded. "Let's get this sorted out." He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer hollow platitudes like it's going to be okay. He offered action. To Chloe, who hated being treated like a fragile porcelain doll, it was the greatest kindness he could have shown. David began to gather her scattered medical supplies. He moved with methodical efficiency, picking up the sterile catheter packages, the spare medication bottles, and the dropped books, placing them respectfully back into her small backpack. He didn't ask questions about the medical gear. He handled it with the casual dignity of a medic who had seen it all. As David worked, Titan stepped forward. The massive German Shepherd approached Chloe's wheelchair. By standard operating procedure, Titan was trained to ignore civilians completely, but working dogs possess an emotional intelligence that often supersedes their training. Titan pressed his large, wet nose gently against Chloe's trembling hand, resting on her armrest. Chloe gasped softly, looking down at the wolf-like animal. She looked at David for permission. "He's a working dog," David said softly without looking up from his task. "But he's also a terrible rule breaker when he knows someone needs a friend. You can pet him. His name is Titan." Chloe buried her fingers into the thick, coarse sable fur at the dog's neck. Titan let out a low, vibrating sigh, resting his heavy chin on her knee. The deep pressure therapy was instantaneous. The frantic pounding in Chloe's chest began to slow, syncing with the calm, steady breathing of the K9. "All right, let's look at the rig," David said, zipping her bag and placing it securely on the footrest. He moved to the right wheel of her custom chair. The impact from Jonah's heavy luggage had misaligned the quick-release camber tube. David ran his large, calloused hands over the matte black titanium. "Custom build," he noted, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Center of gravity is dialed in tight. You're an active user." "I try to be," Chloe managed a weak smile. "The axle pin is jammed." The impact knocked the quick release out of its groove, David assessed. He looked up at her. "I'm going to have to lift the right side of the chair slightly to pop it back into place." "You okay with that?" "Yes." With shocking ease, David gripped the frame with one hand, lifting the right side of the wheelchair and Chloe an inch off the ground. With his other hand, he gave the center hub a sharp, precise palm strike. A loud click echoed, and the wheel locked perfectly back into its true alignment. He set her down gently. "Good as new," he said. Then, his eyes fell on the crushed, decorative box lying amid a sea of shattered glass. Chloe's breath hitched. She stared at the wreckage of the vintage vase. It was for my sister," she whispered, the tears returning with a vengeance. "Her wedding is tomorrow in Denver. I spent 6 months looking for that specific depression glass pattern. It's irreplaceable." David carefully picked up a large, jagged shard of the green glass. He stared at it for a long moment. He knew about broken things. He knew about the pieces of life you could never quite put back together, no matter how hard you tried. He pulled a heavy-duty tactical handkerchief from his cargo pocket and carefully swept the shattered glass into a pile, wrapping it up safely so no one would step on it. He disposed of it in the nearby trash can, his face an unreadable mask. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, returning to her side. "I wish I had been paying attention 5 seconds earlier. I could have stopped him before he hit you." "You stopped him from taking my dignity," Chloe said fiercely, looking directly into his eyes. "You don't need to apologize. Thank you. For everything. Pre-boarding for flight 1184 is now resuming." Brenda's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding significantly more cheerful. "Miss, whenever you are ready, the lane is clear." David stood up to his full height. "Ready to get out of this zoo?" "More than anything," Chloe said. "Tighten. Heel," David commanded. The dog immediately broke contact with Chloe and snapped into position beside David's leg. "Allow me," David said, stepping slightly behind her chair. But he didn't push her. He simply walked with her, matching her pace perfectly, acting as an impenetrable rear guard as she rolled proudly down the jet bridge. The transition from the chaotic terminal into the narrow, pressurized cabin of the Boeing 737 felt like crossing into a different world. The flight crew had already been briefed by the gate agent regarding the incident. As Chloe rolled to the door of the aircraft, the lead flight attendant, a warm woman named Sarah, was waiting with the specialized narrow aisle chair used for boarding passengers with mobility impairments. "Miss Henderson? We are so incredibly sorry about what happened out there," Sarah said, her face lined with genuine concern. "Take all the time you need. We aren't rushing anyone." Chloe transferred from her custom chair into the aisle chair with practiced ease. Usually, this process felt deeply exposing, as passengers waiting behind would sigh or check their watches. But today, the only person behind her was David. He stood silently, holding her backpack, his presence acting as a shield against any potential impatience from the rest of the boarding passengers. "Where are you seated?" David asked as Sarah began to pull Chloe backward down the aisle. "Row 22, seat F," Chloe replied, her voice tired. "A window seat in the back." "Not anymore." A deep, commanding voice interrupted. Stepping out from the cockpit was Captain Thomas Harrison. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the crisp, authoritative uniform of a senior pilot. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the manifest. Captain Harrison looked at Chloe, then his eyes drifted up to David. The pilot's gaze stopped on the subtle, dark metal trident pin fastened to the breast pocket of David's tactical jacket, the Navy SEAL emblem. Captain Harrison's posture straightened imperceptibly. He had flown F-14s in the Gulf War before moving to commercial aviation. He recognized a brother-in-arms immediately. "Miss Henderson," Captain Harrison said gently, "I was just informed of the situation at the gate by airport security. It is unacceptable that you were treated that way while attempting to board my aircraft. As an apology on behalf of the airline, we are upgrading you to first class for the duration of this flight. Seat 2A is yours." Chloe's eyes widened. "Captain, thank you, but you don't have to do that." "I insist," Harrison smiled. He then turned to David. "And I believe, Chief Caldwell, that you are currently ticketed in 14C. Seat 2B just opened up. The gentleman previously occupying it had a sudden change of travel plans. It was Jonah Harrington's seat. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of David's mouth. "Thank you, Captain." The transition was seamless. Chloe was helped into the spacious, plush leather seat of 2A. David stowed her custom wheelchair in the forward closet, a space usually reserved for crew luggage, but the captain had explicitly ordered it cleared for her. David then settled into 2B, right next to her. Titan curled up flawlessly beneath David's legs, taking up minimal space, completely invisible to anyone who didn't know he was there. As the rest of the plane finally began to board, The atmosphere was surprisingly subdued. The passengers who had witnessed the gate incident passed through first class, casting respectful, somewhat awestruck glances toward David and polite, sympathetic smiles toward Chloe. The teenagers who had recorded the video gave David a subtle thumbs up as they walked by. For the first 30 minutes of the flight, as the plane successfully de-iced and roared into the stormy Chicago sky, neither David nor Chloe spoke. They both simply watched the city lights disappear beneath the heavy clouds, enjoying the profound peace that followed a storm. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, David turned toward her. "Denver is a long way for a wedding," he noted quietly. Chloe leaned back, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. "It is, but my sister is the only family I have left. When I had my accident, when I lost the use of my legs, a lot of people disappeared. Friends couldn't handle the new reality, but she stayed. She retrofitted her house. She pushed me in rehab. I wouldn't miss her day for the world." She looked down at her empty lap, the memory of the shattered glass returning. "I just wish I wasn't showing up empty-handed. I wanted to give her something beautiful, something that survived intact, unlike." Well, David understood the unspoken end to that sentence. "Unlike me." "Sometimes," David said, his voice a low rumble over the engine noise. "The things that survive aren't the things made of glass. They're the things made of iron." He looked out the window. "I lost a lot of good men over the last year. Men who were supposed to come home. When you see how fragile life is, you stop tolerating people who try to make it harder for the ones still fighting to live it." He turned back to her, his intense green eyes locking onto hers. "You handled yourself with grace today, Chloe. Don't let a guy in a cheap suit and an expensive watch convince you that you are anything less than a warrior." Down on the floorboards, Titan let out a soft huff, resting his heavy head against the toe of Chloe's shoe. Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. For 3 years she had fought to be seen as normal, to be seen as capable. But sitting next to this hardened soldier, she felt seen for exactly what she was, a survivor. "Thank you, David," she whispered. The flight attendant arrived with the drink cart, offering them complimentary champagne. They clinked their plastic cups together in a quiet toast to small victories. As Chloe dozed off somewhere over Nebraska, wrapped in a first-class blanket and the comforting weight of Titan's presence near her feet, David pulled out his smartphone. He connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. He remembered the specific name of the depression glass pattern Chloe had mentioned at the gate. He opened a secure browser, bypassing several firewalls with practiced ease, and accessed a high-end antique dealer's network. He had some back pay burning a hole in his pocket, and he had a mission to complete before they touched down in the Rocky Mountains. The battle at the gate was over, but the operation was just beginning. The descent into Denver International Airport was turbulent, but for the first time all day, Chloe felt entirely at peace. As the wheels of the Boeing 737 touched down on the tarmac, the cabin erupted in the customary, relieved applause of weary travelers. In first class, David Caldwell simply unbuckled his seatbelt, while Titan, sensing the change in cabin pressure and his handler's movement, stretched his massive front paws out from beneath the seat. When it was time to disembark, Captain Harrison personally stood at the cockpit door to shake David's hand and offer Chloe a warm smile. David assisted Chloe back into her custom matte black wheelchair right at the jet bridge door. As they navigated the massive tented main terminal of Denver International, the reality of their separate paths began to set in. They stopped near the baggage claim carousels. The frantic energy of the airport swirled around them, but in their small orbit there was only a quiet, mutual respect. "My sister is picking me up at the passenger loading zone," Chloe said, looking up at the towering Navy SEAL. "I really don't know how to thank you, David. You gave me back my voice today." David reached into the inner pocket of his tactical jacket and pulled out a small, waterproof notebook. He clicked a pen, jotted down a string of numbers, tore the page out, and handed it to her. "You had your voice the whole time, Chloe. I just provided a little crowd control," David said, a rare, genuine smile softening the hard lines of his face. "If you need anything while you're in Denver, and I mean anything, you call that number. I'll be in town for a few days." Chloe took the paper, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. "What brings you to Denver anyway? You never mentioned it on the flight." "Just tying up some loose ends," David replied cryptically. He gave her a sharp nod, then looked down at his K9. "Titan, Say goodbye. The German shepherd stepped forward and gently bumped his wet nose against Chloe's knee one last time. Then, with a fluid, synchronized movement, man and dog turned and melted into the crowd, leaving Chloe with a fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with altitude sickness. An hour later, Chloe was enveloped in the scent of expensive lilies and polished brass at the historic Brown Palace Hotel in downtown Denver. Her older sister, Jessica, and her soon-to-be brother-in-law, Michael Dobson, had booked a luxurious suite for her. Jessica, a vibrant woman with the same dark curls as Chloe, threw her arms around her sister's neck the moment she rolled through the door. "You made it. The storm delays had me terrified you'd miss the rehearsal dinner." "I'm here," Chloe breathed, burying her face in her sister's shoulder. But as the initial joy settled, the weight of the empty space on Chloe's lap returned. She looked down at her hands. "Jess, I have to tell you something. And I am so sorry." Over the next 20 minutes, Chloe recounted the nightmare at Gate K4. She told them about the arrogant man in the suit, the deafening crash of the 1920s cameo green depression glass vase, and the humiliating apathy of the crowd. Jessica's eyes filled with furious tears. "Oh my God, Chloe, I don't care about the vase. I don't care about a piece of glass. I care that someone treated you like that. I wanted to give you something beautiful," Chloe whispered, wiping her eyes. "Something that survived. You survived." Michael interjected gently. He was a tall, soft-spoken man who worked as a senior vice president at a rising tech logistics firm in the city. "That's the only gift we care about." Chloe smiled gratefully, but the ache of arriving empty-handed lingered. Meanwhile, across town, David Caldwell was stepping out of a rented black Tahoe in the upscale Cherry Creek shopping district. He checked the address on his phone. Harrison and Sons Fine Antiques. David walked in, the bell above the door chiming lightly. Titan walked at a perfect heel, drawing nervous but awestruck looks from the elderly patrons. David approached the counter, where an older man in a tweed vest was polishing a silver tea set. "Can I help you, sir?" the proprietor asked, eyeing the massive dog. "I'm looking for a specific piece of depression glass," David said, his voice businesslike and direct. 1920s. Cameo pattern. Green. A vase. Approximately 10 inches tall. "I know you have it. Your inventory pinged on a private dealer network I accessed 2 hours ago." The dealer blinked, surprised by the military precision of the request. "Well, yes. We just acquired it from an estate sale in Boulder last week. It's a pristine piece, quite expensive." David pulled out a thick money clip, dropping a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the glass counter. "Wrap it in something that can survive a drop." As the dealer scurried to the back room, David's phone vibrated. It was a text from a contact he had back in Virginia, a cyber intelligence specialist who occasionally did off-the-books favors for SEAL Team 6. "Hey boss," the text read. "That video from O'Hare? The one the teenagers took? It hit Twitter and TikTok an hour ago. It's going supernova. 2 million views and climbing. The internet has identified the guy. Jonah Harrington, CEO of Apex Global Acquisitions." David stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Apex Global Acquisitions. He opened a search engine and typed in the company name, followed by Denver. The first news article to pop up made his blood run cold. Apex Global Acquisitions CEO Jonah Harrington in Denver this weekend to finalize hostile takeover of local tech logistics firm, Summit Solutions. David remembered the name Chloe had mentioned on the plane. Her soon-to-be brother-in-law, Michael, worked for a logistics firm. David did a quick LinkedIn search. Michael Dobson, Senior Vice President, Summit Solutions. The universe, David thought, had a profoundly twisted sense of humor. The man who had assaulted Chloe at the airport was currently in Denver to buy the company her brother-in-law worked for. And knowing men like Harrington, he would not take his public humiliation lying down. He would be looking for blood. David grabbed the heavily bubble-wrapped box from the antique dealer, tucked it under his arm, and headed for the Tahoe. Time to go to work, Titan. The private dining room at the Capitol Grill was bathed in the warm, amber glow of crystal chandeliers. It was 7:30 p.m. The night before the wedding, the room was divided. One half was occupied by Jessica and Michael's family and friends for the rehearsal dinner, while the other half of the massive space had been cordoned off for a high-level corporate mixer. It was an unfortunate scheduling conflict that the venue had apologized profusely for, but Summit Solutions needed to wine and dine their prospective buyers, and the restaurant was the best in the city. Chloe sat at the head of the family table, wearing a stunning midnight blue silk dress. Her custom wheelchair was tucked neatly under the mahogany table. She was trying to enjoy the roasted tenderloin and the joyous toasts, but she felt a nagging sense of unease. At 8 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walking through the doors, surrounded by a sycophantic entourage of junior executives, was Jonah Harrington. He was no longer wearing the rumpled charcoal suit from the airport. He was dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo, looking every inch the ruthless corporate titan he believed himself to be. His face was flushed, his eyes darting around the room with a predatory intensity. The viral video from Chicago was tearing his reputation apart online, and his PR team had been screaming in his ear for the last 3 hours. He was angry, cornered, and desperate to exert dominance wherever he could. Michael Dobson stood up from the wedding table, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and walked over to greet the man who would effectively be his new boss by Monday. "Mr. Harrington," Michael said, extending a hand. "Welcome. We're honored you could make it to the corporate mixer side." Jonah ignored the hand. He looked past Michael, his eyes scanning the wedding party. Then, his gaze stopped. He saw the matte black wheels. He saw the midnight blue dress. He saw Chloe. A cruel, vindictive smile spread across Jonah's face. It was the smile of a man who had just found the perfect outlet for his rage. Well, Jonah said loudly, his voice cutting through the soft jazz playing over the speakers. He walked right past Michael and approached the family table. "If it isn't the little bottleneck from Chicago." The chatter at the family table died instantly. Jessica frowned, standing up. "Excuse me? Who are you?" "I'm the man your sister tried to publicly ruin today," Jonah spat, stopping a few feet from Chloe. He leaned over the table, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Did you think you could just sick a stray dog on me and walk away? My PR team is dealing with a nightmare because you couldn't be bothered to stay out of the way of paying customers." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. The humiliation of the airport rushed back, suffocating her. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Michael rushed over, looking panicked. "Mr. Harrington, please. This is a private family event. Chloe is my sister-in-law." Jonah slowly turned to look at Michael. The sadistic joy in his eyes was unmistakable. "Is that right, Dobson? This liability is your family?" "Sir, let me make something abundantly clear to you, Michael," Jonah interrupted, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss that carried across the silent room. "By Monday morning, I own Summit Solutions. I own your division. I own your desk. I am currently dealing with a PR crisis, because this disabled little brat played the victim on camera. If she doesn't leave this restaurant right now, if I have to look at her face for one more second while I try to conduct my business, you won't just be fired. I will blacklist you from every tech firm west of the Mississippi. You will never work in this industry again." Jessica gasped, grabbing Michael's arm. The other executives in the room looked down at their shoes, too afraid of Jonah's power to intervene. Chloe felt the world crumbling around her. Jonah wasn't just attacking her anymore. He was threatening her family's livelihood. He was going to ruin her sister's future husband on the eve of their wedding. The familiar, crushing weight of being a burden slammed into Chloe. She grabbed the push rims of her wheelchair. Tears blurred her vision. "I'll go," Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. She began to back her chair away from the table. "I'm sorry, Jess. I'll just go." "No, Chloe, stop," Jessica cried. "I said, I'll go," Chloe yelled. The devastation complete. Jonah smirked, adjusting his tuxedo cuffs. "Smart girl, finally learned your place. She stays right where she is," the voice echoed from the entrance of the dining room. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a deadly sub-zero resonance that instantly paralyzed the room. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was Chief Petty Officer David Caldwell. He had traded his tactical gear for a flawlessly tailored, midnight black suit that stretched over his broad shoulders. He looked like James Bond, if James Bond spent his weekends kicking down doors in hostile territories. And sitting in perfect, statuesque stillness right beside his left leg was Titan, wearing a formal black leather tracking harness. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't called him. How was he here? David's eyes locked onto Jonah Harrington. The SEAL's expression was devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the face of a man who had calculated the exact trajectory of a kill shot. "You," Jonah breathed, taking an involuntary step backward, the color draining from his face. David began to walk toward the table. The sea of executives and family members parted instinctively, just as they had at O'Hare. The heavy, rhythmic click-clack of Titan's nails on the hardwood floor sounded like a ticking clock. "I told you," David said, his voice dropping an octave as he stopped between Chloe and Jonah, completely shielding her from the CEO's view, "that I didn't care who you were. But it turns out, the rest of the world does." Jonah Harrington tried to muster his corporate bravado, puffing out his chest under his bespoke tuxedo, but his voice betrayed a distinct, desperate tremor. "You're trespassing. This is a private corporate event, you psycho. I have half a mind to have you arrested for stalking. Security." He looked wildly toward the restaurant doors, but the Capitol Grill management, having caught a glimpse of the 90-pound working dog and the sheer, terrifying presence of the man beside him, had wisely decided to stay out of the crossfire. David Caldwell ignored the threat completely. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator circling its prey. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his smartphone, tapping the screen once before holding it up. "As of 10 minutes ago," David said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the dead silent room, "the video of you assaulting this woman at the airport has surpassed 4 million views across 3 platforms. It's the #1 trending topic in the country. They've dubbed you Terminal Tyrant. Catchy. My PR team is having it taken down as we speak." Jonah snapped, sweating profusely. A drop of perspiration rolled down his temple, catching the amber light of the chandeliers. "It's a violation of privacy. It's slander. The internet is forever, Jonah," David replied coldly. "You can't buy your way out of a digital footprint. But honestly, Twitter is the least of your problems tonight." David shifted his gaze, looking over Jonah's shoulder. He scanned the crowd of Summit Solutions executives who had been hovering near the private bar. They were clutching their highball glasses, their faces pale. "Which one of you is William Bradley?" David asked. A distinguished-looking man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stepped forward from the back of the pack. He looked remarkably composed compared to his peers. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Summit Solutions." "Mr. Bradley," David said, his tone shifting from a lethal threat to one of commanding, professional respect. "Are you aware that the man currently attempting a hostile takeover of your company is trending globally for physically attacking a paralyzed woman, destroying her property, and verbally abusing airline staff?" Bradley adjusted his glasses. He looked at Jonah, his expression hardening into granite. "I was just informed by my board of directors 10 minutes ago, yes. Our legal team was actively discussing the implications." "Let me expedite those discussions for you," David offered, his eyes never leaving Bradley. He tapped his phone again. "I forwarded the unedited high-definition footage to the Ethics and Compliance Board of Apex Global Acquisitions 30 minutes ago. I also sent it directly to the SEC, citing grave concerns over corporate stability and shareholder value, given the CEO's very public, unhinged breakdown." Jonah let out a strangled gasp, his hands shaking as he instinctively reached for his own phone in his pocket. It was vibrating furiously. "Furthermore," David continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "I made a personal call to a friend at the Chicago Police Department. Officer Miller processed the witness statements from Gate K4. There is an active warrant being drawn up for your arrest in Cook County for destruction of property, harassment, and assault. If you try to board a plane out of Denver tomorrow, TSA will flag you. You'll be taken out of the airport in handcuffs." The dining room erupted into a chorus of shocked whispers. The junior executives who had walked in with Jonah were now physically backing away from him, creating an expanding circle of isolation around the CEO. Jonah looked like he was going to vomit. His face had gone completely ashen. "You're lying," he croaked, though the frantic scrolling on his own phone confirmed every word. "You're a nobody. You're just a thug with a mutt. You can't do this to me. I built Apex." "I am a chief petty officer in the United States Navy," David said, He took one single definitive step forward, closing the distance so he was towering directly over Jonah. Beside him, Titan mirrored the movement. The German shepherd didn't bark, but he let out a low, vibrating growl from deep within his chest, a sound that rattled the crystal water glasses on the mahogany tables. Jonah froze, terrified to move a muscle. "My job," David whispered, the ice in his voice freezing the air between them, "is protecting the vulnerable from domestic and foreign threats. And right now, Harrington, you are the biggest threat in this room." David turned his attention back to William Bradley, ignoring the trembling CEO entirely. "Mr. Bradley, you heard him threaten to blacklist a dedicated senior vice president from the entire tech industry simply because he happens to be marrying the sister of the woman Jonah assaulted. Is this the kind of erratic, vindictive leadership you want dictating the future of your life's work?" William Bradley stood in silence for a long moment. He looked at Michael Dobson, who was standing protectively near Jessica and Chloe. Then Bradley looked at the sweating, pathetic mess that was Jonah Harrington. "Mr. Harrington," Bradley said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Summit Solutions was built on a foundation of integrity. Our board has a strict, non-negotiable morality clause regarding mergers and acquisitions. Threatening the livelihood of my employees and terrorizing their families is where I draw the line." "William, be reasonable," Jonah pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's $1 billion deal. You're going to tank your own stock over a misunderstanding at an airport?" "The acquisition is officially off," Bradley stated unequivocally. "The deal is dead. And if you attempt a hostile proxy fight, I will personally ensure every shareholder sees that video before they cast a vote. I suggest you leave my dining room before I call security to have you forcibly removed." Jonah's jaw went slack. The merger he had spent 2 grueling years orchestrating, the crown jewel that was supposed to secure his legacy on Wall Street, had just evaporated into thin air. He looked at David, then down at the terrifying wolf-like dog, and finally at Chloe, who was watching him from her wheelchair. There was no smugness left in the CEO's eyes, no arrogant superiority. There was only the hollow, devastating realization of his own total ruin. Without another word, Jonah turned. He didn't look at his entourage. He practically fled the room, pushing blindly past the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the lobby of the restaurant. The silence that followed his departure was absolute. Slowly, David turned around to face the family table. The icy, lethal demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by the gentle, grounding presence that Chloe had relied on back in Chicago. "You didn't have to offer to leave," David told her quietly, his green eyes softening. "You never have to back down from bullies. Not for anyone." Chloe was crying, but this time, the tears weren't born of humiliation or despair. They were tears of overwhelming relief, awe, and profound gratitude. "How did you know where to find me? How did you know he was going to be here? You're not the only one who knows how to plan a complex operation." David smiled slightly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. He gestured to the doorway. A waiter, looking thoroughly bewildered by the evening's events, wheeled in a small silver dessert service cart. But there was no cake on it. Sitting in the exact center of the silver platter was a square cardboard box, expertly wrapped in heavy, shock-absorbent packaging and tied elegantly with a silver ribbon. David lifted the box with large, careful hands and placed it gently onto Chloe's lap. "On the plane, you said you didn't want to show up to the wedding empty-handed," David said softly, the ambient noise of the room fading into the background. "You said you wanted to give your sister something that survived, something beautiful." Chloe's hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the silver ribbon. She pulled it loose, opened the thick cardboard flaps, and carefully peeled back the layers of heavy protective foam. There, gleaming perfectly under the crystal chandeliers of the Capitol Grill, was a 1920s cameo green depression glass vase. It was identical to the one that had been shattered on the patterned carpet of O'Hare Airport, flawless, intricately patterned, and completely, perfectly whole. A collective gasp went through the family table. Jessica covered her mouth with both hands, a sob escaping her throat. Michael put an arm around his fiancée, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Chloe looked up at David, her vision blurred with fresh tears. "How? This is literally impossible. These are so rare. How on earth did you find this?" "I have a guy in cyber intel who owed me a favor." He pinged an antique dealer's private network here in Denver. David explained casually, as if tracking down an 80-year-old piece of glass was a standard military maneuver. Consider it a wedding gift. From Titan and me. Down on the hardwood floor, Titan let out a happy, vibrating huff. He stepped forward and rested his heavy, massive head gently on Chloe's footrest, his tail wagging a slow, rhythmic beat against the table leg. Chloe didn't bother trying to find the words. She reached out, taking David's large, calloused hand in both of hers, squeezing with all the strength she had. The look in her eyes conveyed a lifetime of gratitude. The next afternoon, the Denver sun shone brilliantly over the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, pouring through the stained glass windows of the historic Brown Palace Hotel. The wedding was a masterpiece of joy, resilience, and unadulterated love. Chloe, looking radiant in her midnight blue maid of honor dress, rolled down the aisle with her head held high, her custom black wheelchair gliding smoothly over the polished marble floors. When it was time for the reception in the grand ballroom, the 1920s cameo green glass vase sat proudly at the absolute center of the head table. It held a vibrant, cascading bouquet of white roses, a breathtaking, physical testament to survival. And sitting at a quiet table near the back of the room, watching the celebration unfold with a contented, easy smile, was a man in a dark suit and his 90-pound shadow. When the speeches were over, the champagne had been toasted, and the live band struck up a smooth, swinging jazz number. Chloe wheeled herself away from the head table and navigated through the crowd toward the back of the room. She stopped beside David's table. Titan immediately lifted his head, his ears perking up in greeting. "So," Chloe said, a playful, challenging glint in her eye as she looked up at the towering Navy SEAL. "Do highly trained, lethal combat operatives know how to dance?" David stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at her, a deep, rich chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Only if the dog gets to lead." As David escorted her to the edge of the polished wooden dance floor, the trauma, the noise, and the profound cruelty of the airport felt like they belonged to another lifetime entirely. Chloe Henderson was no longer the invisible woman in the wheelchair, trapped by the apathy of strangers. She was surrounded by family, protected by fierce, unyielding loyalty, and entirely, wonderfully unbroken. In a world that often feels indifferent to the struggles of the vulnerable, it is the quiet courage of individuals that restores our faith in humanity. The horrific apathy Chloe faced at the airport was shattered not by a grand orchestrated movement, but by one man and his loyal K9 deciding that enough was enough. David Caldwell and Titan proved that true strength isn't about the power you wield, but how you use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Bullies like Jonah thrive in silence, but they crumble when exposed to the light of genuine justice and unyielding integrity. If this story of resilience, instant karma, and the incredible bond between a Navy SEAL and his dog moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends to spread the message that kindness always wins, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true life stories. Let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were at the airport.